Now, while the US Secretary of State meets Russia's foreign minister in Riyadh, President Trump's Ukraine envoy is in Brussels for a meeting with European leaders. EU chief Ursula von der Leyen told Keith Kellogg that Europe wants to work with Washington to bring about peace. She also said European nations are ready to step up, including doing more to arm Ukraine. European leaders are mounting a diplomatic push to be included in peace talks after Kellogg last week ruled out European participation. Let's get more from DW's Teri Schultz in Brussels. Hi, Teri. So do we know anything about what came out of this meeting between Trump's Ukraine envoy and the EU's Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa?
We've had a couple of brief readouts, Anya. We haven't been able to see either von der Leyen or Costa and ask them questions directly. But in Ursula von der Leyen's report on her meeting with Keith Kellogg, she said that she emphasized that, contrary to what we often hear coming out of the White House, the European Union is actually the greatest contributor of assistance to Ukraine when it comes to overall aid, with the 27 member states and the EU institutions taken together. And even in military assistance, it equals the U.S. aid. So you can tell that she very much wants to counter this idea that President Trump has that the U.S. is carrying the burden in Ukraine. She also says the EU is ready to do more. Antonio Costa has only given us a single post on X saying that any ceasefire agreement would have to be accompanied by security guarantees. Notably, neither of these officials talked about the security force that the United States is expecting Europe to provide that would monitor that ceasefire. And both of them said that the EU stands by Ukraine, its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. So I'm sure that those are welcome messages in Kyiv.
And this meeting in Brussels, of course, took place at the same time as the US-Russia talks in Riyadh. Was that on purpose, do you think?
I know for sure that the Kellogg meetings have been long in the works, many weeks in the planning, and it probably for him just made sense to come on the heels of the Munich Security Conference. He's also going on to Poland and then to Ukraine, where he's expected to visit the front line. So that trip certainly is quite complex and has been planned for some time. Now, when it comes to Marco Rubio, he was already coming to Munich, going to Israel, and then going to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE after that to talk about Mideast issues. And I checked back on the State Department's website to see if there was any sign 5 days ago when they announced this that he'd be meeting the Russians at any leg of this trip. And there wasn't. In fact, all of the issues mentioned were directly related to the Middle East. So I think that probably came about very quickly, and it was simply convenient to have this happen in Saudi Arabia while he was already there. But the speed that this meeting has been scheduled is something that certainly is making the Russians quite happy and the Europeans quite nervous, because they don't feel that there's been enough preparation for this meeting, enough consultations with the Europeans and, of course, with Ukraine itself.
Teri, what do European leaders expect from that meeting between Rubio and Lavrov today?
Well, Nicole, European leaders are going to be trying to read into Marco Rubio's comments that this is not a serious negotiation yet with Russia, that this is more talks about talks. Now, we don't know if he says that just to sort of calm down the fears and outrage from the Ukrainians and Europeans that they're not being included at these early stages. And we also don't know what Rubio and Lavrov are going to talk about with regard to potential sanctions relief. In statements both sides put out before this meeting, they talked about removing unilateral barriers. That would definitely undermine efforts to take money out of the Kremlin war chest. But regardless of what they talk about, it's definitely a PR win for Moscow. After all, they're sitting there with America's top diplomat, and there's not a European or Ukrainian in sight.
Mm-hmm. European leaders certainly not happy with that meeting taking place in Saudi Arabia today. What do you think their next steps could be?
I think we're in for a lot of meetings, Nicole, and that makes sense because the Europeans have to shore up the impression that they are united, that they are able to provide a European pillar that would be a partner for the United States in negotiations that are to come about the fate of Ukraine. This is something that even NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has told Europeans they have to do. Don't just demand a seat at the table. Tell what you would bring to that table. So we're going to see more meetings, I would say, like the one that was held yesterday in Paris, but this is not a one-way street, because even the UK, which is now out front in saying it would send troops to an eventual ceasefire, to monitor an eventual ceasefire, they're pointing out that they need U.S. backup. They need what's called ISR, intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance from the U.S. to help protect those troops. And at the moment, there's a questionnaire that the U.S. sent to their allies asking what they would be willing to provide to this effort eventually, and asking what they would expect back from the United States. So this is very much, at the moment, a conversation happening behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. And another conversation happening behind the scenes was the one between French President Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump. They spoke on the phone for 30 minutes yesterday after that summit in Paris. What do we know about that call? And could that be a sign that the Europeans are, in fact, not as sidelined as the U.S. is letting on right now?
Well, I don't think a phone call is going to substitute for a seat at the eventual table, but certainly Macron would have been conveying to President Trump that Europeans have agreed on some principles, if not on the outlines of an actual force. We got some talking points from EU officials after the meeting that said that, look, we agree on the U.S. approach, that this should be handled as peace through strength. We agree that the Europeans would provide a peacekeeping force, given that we get some U.S. backup for that. And we should also emphasize, Nicole, that President Macron followed his phone call to President Trump with a phone call to President Volodymyr Zelensky. So that's a sign that even if the U.S. Is not perhaps putting Zelensky at the table, the Europeans very much understand that the fate of European security is tied to the fate of Ukrainian security, and they are giving President Zelensky, solidarity in this moment of great uncertainty.
This DW Brussels correspondent, Teri Schultz. Thank you so much, Teri. Always great speaking to you. Let's take a closer look and bring in Anna Wieslander. She's the director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council. Welcome back to DW. Anna, now you've said that any peace will only be sustainable if accepted by all parties, with Ukraine not at the table. Are these negotiations doomed to fail?
Well, if Ukraine is not included, yes, they are definitely doomed to fail. And I think it would be wise for the US to really take that in and make a plan ahead that includes both Ukraine at the table and, of course, Europe. What we have today is a first meeting, and State Secretary Rubio has underlined that this is just, not even the start of the negotiations, just a way of starting some kind of talks. But of course, what we have seen is that the Russians have been, I believe, pleasantly surprised by the almost desperate US attempts to get these peace talks, this peace deal moving. And at this point, it's really 1-0 to Russia. And that will never bring a sustainable peace between Russia and Ukraine, and for the sake of European security as well.
Sustainability aside, does Ukraine currently have a choice other than accepting whatever the Trump administration in coordination with the Kremlin comes up with?
Yes, of course, I think that Ukraine has a choice. This is not static even. I think what we heard yesterday, that President Macron tries to both talk to Trump and to President Zelensky. I've heard that already at the Munich Security Conference, there were outreaches to President Trump on behalf of Ukraine and Zelensky from European state leaders, that we are not giving up this. This is how we have to run this show if it's going to be a sustainable peace. So I would say this is not static. Another option that also is on the table, and I think that's what we will see, is also that Ukrainians will not put down their arms. They will continue the fight for their sovereignty and their country and their territory. So Ukraine is not an object in this. Ukraine is a subject. Ukraine has agency, and I don't think we should. There has been a tendency throughout this conflict and war to underestimate Ukraine, and I think that's very dangerous to do that. I think a lot of European leaders realize it. I'm not sure how much the Trump administration realizes it yet, but they will definitely meet it, I'm sure.
Does Ukraine have the means to enforce that agency you speak about if U.S. support were to break away after a possible deal with Russia?
For some time, the Ukrainians can continue to fight. For instance, on ammunition, looks pretty good. And Europe has a capacity to step up its military support even further. There are weapon systems and deliveries that have not been made. For instance, we heard Merz, perhaps chancellor-to-be in Germany, saying that if he became chancellor, he would provide the Taurus system to Ukraine, which Ukraine has been waiting for a long time. So European countries can also step up support to Ukraine. They cannot perhaps provide everything that the US provides, but definitely it doesn't have to be a white flag for Ukraine just because the US decides to push. And I think that overall would be very unwise for the Trump administration. I mean, we have to remember that the US also wants a credible peace, and they want to be able to settle this. So that's actually, I think, the main point here is that, start listening to each other so that we can create this together. And I think at this point, the US also needs to take those in, both Ukraine and European voices.
Yeah. You specialize in issues related to Northern Europe's security. You said right now the score is 1-0 for Russia. How worried is the Baltic region about an emboldened Russia, while the U.S. commitment to Europe appears increasingly tenuous?
I think the region is very worried whether we are at the very vicinity of Russia and Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. It's a terrible way of fighting that is very close to both the Baltic states and the Nordic, the whole region. And also one has to remember that an emboldened Russia, which perceives that it gets a lot of concessions from, not least from the US, which is really admires, and it wants to be in parity with the US when it comes to global issues. So if the US gives after, that will really spur Russia's appetite for more. And this region is nearby. We can do a lot together on deterrence. We have professional armies, and we are also devoting between 2 to up to 5% of GDP on defense. So I think on the conventional side, we are in a good spot. However, we can never provide the nuclear deterrent towards Russia. For that, we need external help outside of the region. And that's also, in the end, an important, crucial factor, actually, to balance against in this situation.
Anna Wieslander from the Atlantic Council. Many thanks. Great speaking to you.
Thank you.
Estonia and Lithuania, precisely, are the first NATO countries to heed U.S. President Donald Trump's call to increase military spending. Estonian Prime Minister Kristen Michal has pledged to spend 5% of the country's GDP on defense. After 50 years under Soviet control, the threat of Russian invasion doesn't seem far-fetched to many Estonians. But can Estonia afford to spend so much on defense? And what else will it have to cut to do so? DW's Sergei Satanovsky reports from Tallinn.
This AI-powered defense system now supports Ukrainians on the battlefield.
So they are surveillance platforms which help soldiers and armies in Ukraine to see you're near the enemy lines, where are the enemy troops moving or what kind of threats there are.
Companies like DevSec Intel have been thriving in Estonia over the past 3 years, boosted in part by Estonia's relatively high defense spending of just under 4%. That's more than Europe's biggest economy, Germany, which spends only 2% of GDP. But the tiny Baltic nation wants to send a signal to its neighbor, Russia.
In Europe, but in all over the world, to be honest, the geopolitical situation is quite intense. And Europe definitely has to put more money into their defense, not only the eastern border of European Union or even NATO.
Estonia's prime minister says the country aims to meet US President Donald Trump's call for NATO countries to increase their defense spending even further to 5%. The government says it will pay for the rise by reducing social spending, with cuts to parental allowances, university scholarships and disability benefits.
5% of Estonia's GDP is about 2 billion euros, a huge amount for a country whose economy has been shrinking in recent years. But what do Estonians make of these new costs?
We'll have to find the money. What do we do if our neighbor attacks us?
We live next to Russia. There's nothing we can do about that. We have to be prepared for anything. Defense spending is a terrible story because it's all about killing people on all sides. I believe they'll find a place to cut where, hopefully, the least harm is done to the smallest group of people. It's inevitable.
You can do 5%, but please make sure the funds are generated as well.
To mitigate the pain of these deep cuts to social spending, Tallinn is hoping for help from Europe. Estonia and other EU nations have proposed a joint European borrowing mechanism.
But for Europe, actually, we can see that one of the possibilities is the defense funds. We actually see altogether what kind of different technology or ammunition or weaponry we need, and we can procure it all together.
EU leaders will discuss this concept tested during the COVID-19 pandemic at the next European Council meeting in March. Like other Baltic nations located on NATO's eastern flank, Estonia wants its allies to reach a joint defense decision as soon as possible.